we're going to jump to the next presentation about actually the consumers' barriers and levers, which was one of the key things that I shared previously on the 5 key challenges for reuse to be competitive. So Claire Dale leads the Behavioral Insights team sustainability work in France, where she applies behavioral science to encourage more sustainable everyday choices. Her focus is on sustainable consumption, including promoting reuse, buying second-hand, repairing, and improving recycling habits, both at home and in professional settings. She has led projects for the French government, public agencies, local authorities, producer responsibility organizations, and businesses. Claire also serves on the expert committee of Quota Climat, a non-profit funded by the French Environment Agency to track how climate issues are covered in the media and how this influences public behavior. Prior to her role at BIT, she was a senior policy advisor at the UK Environment Ministry. Thank you, Claire, to be here.
Thank you so much, Alexi, and thanks for the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Is that perfect? So, I'm going to give this a go. So thanks so much for the invitation, and I'm really happy to be following up on what Catherine has just said. I will be echoing a lot of that in terms of trying to make reuse as simple as possible and as attractive as possible for consumers. We're going to only have time today to do a whistle-stop tour of a few things that Behavioural Insights have to say about how we can promote reuse from a consumer perspective. Bear with me. We won't be able to cover everything. Behaviour is quite complex. There will be time for questions as well afterwards, so happy to take some. But I'm just going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour on a few kind of core things that we want you to think about behaviour-wise in terms of promoting reuse. Before we get into it, just really quickly to give you a sense of who BIT is. So BIT was actually born in the UK government as the first kind of pioneer organisation to leverage what we know of human behaviour and what we can know through empirical research and testing to leverage that to promote social and behavioural change. And as Alexi mentioned, I focus specifically on leveraging those behavioural insights for more sustainable behaviours and consumption in particular. So obviously a lot of you in this room will be focused on the nitty-gritty details of getting reuse to work, getting it at scale, which Catherine has touched on in terms of some of the trickiness of that. And obviously all of that is essential for reuse to be able to develop. But today I'm going to try and want you to think a little bit about putting the human element at the center of that and thinking of reuse as well in terms of the number of behaviors that consumers need to perform for reuse to actually happen. And that's not even thinking of the behaviors of other people in the system. Behaviors, obviously, of consumers are within a wider system of producers, retailers, other professionals, and so on that need to perform certain behaviors for reuse to happen. But focusing and keeping it focused on individual consumers, everything, obviously, for reuse to happen relies on a set of behaviors that need to be performed and repeated. We don't want people to try reuse once and switch out of it. So it's a set of behaviors that we want people to develop and entrench in their daily consumption habits. So from the point of purchase, do I go for the reusable option when there's a competition? It's been touched on by Alexi and Catherine. There are times and systems in which there's different options and there isn't just reuse. That actually is the norm across most places now. There's the behaviors I perform at home in terms of consuming my product. Crucially, there's what I do with the empty container before I return it. Do I know what to do with it? Do I think I need to wash it if there is actually a system that washes it for me? Do I have the place to put it in? Do I have apprehensions about putting it in my house, leaving it dirty, quote unquote? And then do I actually return the container? What do I do with it at the end of the life cycle? And that's a particularly important behavior in contexts like France, for example, where there's quite an entrenched habit around recycling and strong messaging to push for recycling at home. How does that enter into competition with returning if there are RVMs in my store for me to return my containers to? So once we get a sense of those different behaviors, I have some bad news. That is that we can lose people at every stage of that. We can lose people before they even know that reuse is an option for them. We can lose them before they make the decision to purchase. And then we can lose them even if they have that intention and maybe not perform all of the other behaviors. Crucially, we can lose them if they've performed all of that cycle once, but something went wrong. The RVM was broken. It was a painful experience. They didn't know what to do. It was heavy, whatever it may be. And then they don't repeat that. And we want this to be a habitual consumption pattern. So Before we actually get to the behavior itself, there's a number of things that you need to have for people to even formulate the intention to perform a behavior. So here, thinking about reuse, is reuse something that I know about? Like, is that an option that I'm familiar with? Do I know that it exists? But also, do I think it's worth it? Do I see the impact of it on my own life or on the environment? Does it resonate with my own beliefs and attitudes in terms of how I see myself and how I see society? Is it something that is prevalent around me? Is it the normal behavior that I see around me? Is it otherwise a behavior that I associate with desirable identities, with groups that I would like to belong to, or groups that I think are positive in terms of their influence? Do I think I can do it? Is what we call behavioral control or self-efficacy. Do I get the sense that this behavior is within my reach? It's something that I can do. All of those will impact the intention to perform a behavior in various proportions, and they will vary from individual to individual. Again, as I said, behavior is complex. But we need to be nailing those different things if we want people to even think about adopting reuse, making sure that it resonates with who they think that they are, making sure that they know that it exists, making sure that they think it's a positive thing to be doing and that they can do it within their reach. Then we get to intention. If we've ticked all of those boxes and we get people to think, yes, okay, I want to do reuse, then we still lose people between that intention and action. You might be familiar with this concept of the intention-action gap. I like to illustrate it by thinking of the many times that on a Sunday I think I'm going to go to the gym 3 times in the next week. And I do have the very best of intentions. I think it's great for me. I know it's good. I know I can possibly do it. And somehow end up the following Sunday not having been to the gym probably a single time. And so this intention-action gap is where also a lot of things can be done in terms of behavioral design, improving the consumer journey, making sure that we make it as easy as possible, as Catherine was saying, so that the action follows on from that intention that we formulated. Just to say why that matters in terms of those different steps, it means that we can't just stop at the headlines of abstract support. When we look at green behaviors in general and in reuse in particular, there is quite a lot of declared intention to adopt the behavior, and actually across green behaviors, in all the surveys that I've been seeing in the EU, in France, there usually is very strong declared support for adopting behaviors. Nuancing that a little bit, the more effortful the behavior, the lower the intention usually, but when it comes to kind of consumption behaviors, recycling in particular, but even reuse, we get those kind of very high figures, and sure, they're surveys, and there might be a little bit of that's kind of over-exaggerated, but still, 92% of French consumers in a recent survey done by Reloop and Ipsos would say that they were in support for the introduction of a DRS. And when you broaden it to more like sustainable consumption in general, you get up to 98% of people that say they would be willing to do at least one thing. That's huge. And yet, don't want to go back to the gloomy example of me and my failed gym routine, but somehow those don't always translate into action, do they? And even for popular behaviors like recycling, we do see errors, we do see waste that isn't sorted properly, we do see that it doesn't necessarily translate into action. And that's why we can't stop at those headlines. I'm going to just, to illustrate that, go through a few kind of common misconceptions that we may have about how to promote reuse, and just to get you kind of your gears thinking behaviorally, to illustrate how some of those things may go wrong, and we might lose people even if they have the intention to perform the behavior. So one of the first things that sometimes I hear is that we just need to tell people that reuse is an option. Which, interestingly, from the survey, from the data that you had, means that even some people don't necessarily need that much information to switch to it. But for kind of the bulk of consumers, we want to be thinking about how we inform them. And sadly, it's not going to be a one-shot type scenario. It's not going to be about one upstream comms campaign at the launch of a system that's going to cut it. That's a prerequisite. We need to be telling people that reuse is an option, that's an option for them, and so on. But we need to be thinking in terms of consumer journeys as well. Throughout the consumer journey, in store, on the packaging itself, at checkout, near the RVM, and so on, just to make sure that we really nail that message that reuse is an option and it's there for them. It's not about just telling them once and they'll come. A second thing is, and Catherine was touching on that earlier, make reuse as easy as possible. Definitely, that's a prerequisite. In the same survey that Reloop and Ipsos did, 70%, I think it was, of French consumers said they wouldn't go more than 10 minutes out of their way to go and return containers. I suspect that's probably also a survey designed that 70% of people said they would go up to 10 minutes. In practice, I wouldn't be surprised that that would go down in terms of people's willingness to go out of their way to return containers. So, and the German experience, I think, in Quebec as well, where they're doing a real effort at having as fine grain of a distribution of the collection points, really echo that. You want reuse and you want the return to be as easy as possible, and that just goes by accessibility in the first instance. And I know that's probably incredibly technically difficult to do. It's probably some of your jobs around the room to make sure that those collection points happen and that they're easy and accessible and so on. My bad/positive news, I guess, is that that just isn't necessarily enough, in the sense that you want to make it easy, and that's the basics. We want to nail that. But we also want to be thinking that easy doesn't necessarily mean the same thing for everyone. And some of the research that we've done into this to date really highlights the different profiles of consumers and the expectation on their consumer journey that easy doesn't necessarily mean the same thing for them. So we have some people who will be very low tech. They will expect and want to be able to get their deposit back in cash at the point of collection as soon as they return the container, whether because they're not very tech friendly or because they have data concerns and don't want to link to their account or anything like that. We have people who will want really high tech options. Consignation, the Quebec-based operator, has a range of different systems to make sure that different consumers can return in different ways, whether that means that they can put bulk bags that are then sorted by someone else and traced back to their own account, whether that means that they can get the cash back on site. And that seems to be very popular in terms of kind of bringing in different consumer profiles to return. They also, interestingly, have, in some collection points, some helpful staff that have been trained to help people as well. And I think that's a particularly interesting lesson for places like France, where we're going to be cultivating new habits and asking people to do something for the first time. That can be daunting. And actually, it's one of the main barriers to refill in store, is that people are scared of not doing it right and being embarrassed and not knowing what to do. Maybe we can ease that a little bit by making sure that we have in-person help to make it as accessible as possible. A third option and idea, and I do think we need more evidence for this, but is to thinking about making it easy by making it the default. There's been a few experimentations. This is an example of one that's been done in Germany with stores, including IKEA, where they just switched the default to be reuse. So you could still opt out and you could still get your takeaway in normal containers, but you had to kind of do the extra mile and make an effort to choose that over choosing the reusable option. And that's led to a 36%, so from 12 to 36% increase in terms of the use of reusable containers, and a decrease in 40% of the reusable cups that were distributed by IKEA in that period. The researcher in me has to tell you that I think we need more research, in particular to look at what happens at the end of that life cycle. I don't know of any studies that's looked at putting reuse as a default and then checking that people don't actually throw it away at the end of the life cycle. So just a word of caution on that, but that might be a way of making it easier for consumers. A third assumption, I think, is to think that consumers will just instantly grasp and know that reuse is the more sustainable option. I don't know how much you can actually see on this graph from far away, and also it's in French. But this is a study done by Citeo in 2021, asking consumers, what do you think is the most sustainable type of packaging? And 71% of people said a recyclable one, whereas only 10% of people said a packaging that can be reused more than once. And I think that's quite an interesting starting point to realize that for industry professionals, for people who are studying the LCA all day long, it might just make intuitive sense that reuse can be the more sustainable option. But for consumers, it seems to very much still be, at least in France, that recycling and recyclable are still identified as being the sustainable option. And so what can we do about that? Well, lots of testing to be done, in my sense. The research that we've seen up to date hasn't really been exploring kind of how to act on that, but just in terms of behavioral science more generally, we know that there are different levers that you can pull to try and rectify consumers' perception of the environmental impact. So I think obviously communicating about it and making it known how and in which conditions reuse can be more environmentally friendly. But I think also thinking about how to make it tangible for the consumer. One thing about shifting behaviors towards more sustainability that's incredibly hard is that you don't see the carbon footprint of your meal choice. You don't see the little carbon bubbles of your steak over your plant-based option when you're at the counter. We need to make it tangible for people why it's beneficial and what it means. And I think we can get inspiration from other places for that. So l'ADEME, the French Environment Agency, has been thinking of lots of different tools to try and make it more tangible what carbon means, for example. And they have this interesting calculator that I like to play around with to show people what is a ton of CO2. And they give you equivalents in terms of everyday things that you can relate to in a way that make more cognitive sense in terms of the impact. And also this is the French train operator that sends you a little recap at the end of the year to tell you how much you've saved in terms of carbon footprint by going train and not plane. And they also try and make it tangible, because my brain can't really compute what that many kilometers on the train is, but I can maybe relate to like more fun ways as well, or more like everyday ways of thinking about environmental impacts. And I think, let's maybe try and do that for reuse as well. And the Quebec DRS operator that we spoke to in previous studies has said that they actually try and communicate the environmental impact of their decision on the receipts. So I don't think, to my knowledge, that hasn't been tested or evaluated in terms of whether it works to shape behavior. But I think there's an interesting inkling there that you would get in the same way you would get, information about the deposit amount, or that you would get information in terms of congratulations, this is how you've managed, like this is how much waste you've avoided through this behavior. I think that's something worth looking into. And finally, again, on our whistle-stop tour, there are many, many more barriers and misconceptions, and I'll be happy to go into that if there's interest. But one thing is, there seems to be that consensus that the deposit itself isn't enough to drive motivation. And sure enough, in all the surveys that I've seen, whether it's in countries that already have a deposit return scheme, or when you're asking consumers what would be the main reason for you to do it, getting the money back is the main driver for return. So here you see that in the study that was done by Tomra in 2022 across several countries, 76% would say that was the reason for bringing it back, with a slight caveat that was, in the sense of returning for recycling, not necessarily for reuse, where you can make the argument that if people understand that reuse can be superior environmentally, that those would shift slightly. But the numbers that we have are for reasons to return, basically. And yes, that's a really critical thing to be thinking about. How do you make reuse and return attractive in terms of the deposit amount? But I would also think, that we need to be thinking about how do we make sure that also stays attractive in terms of the purchasing point. Remember, I showed you the different journey. It's not because it's attractive at the end, returning, that it's attractive at the start. In particular, in countries where there will be, as in France, a competition of non-reusable options that won't, at least as I understand it, have a deposit necessarily. And in places, again, as in France, where there's a high concern for purchasing power. A recent survey of 10,000 something participants done by l'ADEME showed that actually purchasing power was one of the biggest sources of concern for people in terms of switching onto a deposit return scheme. 60 to 70% of people, depending on the level of deposit that was given, said that was a concern for them. So what do we do with that? Well, obviously we want to try and find the sweet spot of an amount for the deposit that's both attractive to return it. 45% of people in the survey that you ran said that they wouldn't necessarily do it if the amount wasn't attractive enough to make it worth their while. So sure, we want to nail that. But we also want to make sure that we make it attractive at the point of purchase. Beyond finding that sweet spot, which is something that I know, technicians around the room will be thinking of, we can also think of different behavioral designs to make the deposit more attractive and salient. So at the point of purchase, especially for a new behavior, when people aren't used to seeing a higher price at the point of purchase, how do we single that out and make it tangible for consumers, why they're paying that, what it's for, how do they get it back at the end of the day? There's a million different ways that you can play around a label on a shelf to make it behaviorally interesting and make sure that you communicate the price clearly, what people are paying for, what they'll be getting back, and why it's worth their while. And then I think, and going back to our previous point around the environment as well, tap into other sources of motivation. There isn't just the price. There is this pro-environmental motivation. If people do understand that reuse is an option, tap into that. There's also evidence to say that there's some barriers associated with the social representations that people may have around reuse. How do we make sure that people think reuse, yes, it's for me. It's not just for the bobo, for the green, or alternatively, there's some research that points to some negative connotations around returning that could be seen as something that is for people in need and so on. How do we make sure that we avoid those pitfalls and make reuse socially desirable as well? As I said, whistle-stop tour. I'm just going to quickly say that we've been working on this topic with Citeo, and we have Manon over there. Also, I couldn't put her name on the slide, apologies for that. But Manon Désert, who leads the behavioral change work at Citeo, who's been involved in some of this work. And so if you want to reach out to her, these are my details, and I'm available for more questions, all behavioral. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much, Claire. Very interesting about all the consumers, because for sure, if the consumers don't buy it, nothing happens at the end. Even if you did the best model you want, even if you have everything, the infrastructures and everything, but if they didn't buy it, nothing happened. A question for you that we have prepared, and after that I will let the public ask one or maybe two questions. What are the most common psychological barriers preventing consumers from adopting reuse? And how can this be effectively addressed through design, consumer journey, or communication?
Yeah, thank you, Alexi. And hopefully this presentation has given everyone a sense of the complex interplay of factors that may drive or prevent reuse. And I think we tend to think a lot about behavioral science as sprinkling kind of cognitive biases on things. And yes, there will be some psychological barriers. As I said, how people will understand the price deposit. Will they suffer from what we call a present bias, in the sense of, seeing that upfront cost and not necessarily seeing, understanding, or wanting to understand that they're going to get it back in the future? Like, that's definitely biases that are at play. But really, I think, especially when we're thinking of cultivating new habits, as in France, we need to be weighing the weight of the different factors. And I think psychological barriers, yes. As I said, how do people perceive it? Do they understand it? Do they think it's for them? Like, I think that social identity will be a crucial aspect. Do they see the environmental impact? Do they relate to it and understand how it's tangible? All of these are at play. But I think we also want to be thinking of their behaviors within a system and understand that, beyond the psychological aspects, there's also socially what's happening around me. How do I perceive that behavior in terms of it being the norm or being something that is becoming the norm? But also in terms of structure. We operate within a system. Does the consumer journey allow it? Does it make it the easier option? Does it make it the obvious choice? Is it facilitated every step of the way? Is the infrastructure behind it? Do I have to wait a ton? So I would say there's definitely lots of different factors at play, and hopefully we gave you a sense here of the first few ones, but I wouldn't overweight psychological barriers necessarily, in the sense that, especially when we're setting up a new system, we want to make sure that that first experience is positive, that the second one is positive, and that we entrench those behaviors, and that requires the system to be working as well.
And somewhere you have also kind of two kind of people. You have people over, let's say, over 40 who already knew how reuse work when they were young, and they are like, it's kind of a nostalgia about reuse. And you have this new under 40 years old who are like, just no recycling bin, and how to attract them now, and this saying that, yeah, you heard about recycling, that is great, but now there is something better, and how to involve them, this younger generation, into reuse.
Yeah, it's a tricky point also, because I think beyond generation, there are just so many subgroups, right, that we can belong to, and that will shift our willingness to adopt those types of behaviors. And that's why I tried to show with the very simplified model of behavior, but to give you a sense that also you don't fit squarely into a box, the 18 to 24 or the 20, and like there will be other factors at an individual level that will affect your willingness and your capacity to adopt those behaviors. Interestingly, on the generational point, across survey data that we see on recycling, for example, the young tend to say that they're more, sensitized and interested in the environment, but actually, at least in France, tend to have lower recycling rates than older generations as well. So again, just to highlight, that doesn't necessarily translate into action, and you can make lots of hypotheses that younger people have less room in their house and so on, and that affects recycling and so on, but it's just not as linear as that. And so I would encourage us to think, of people who have had a first experience of a DRS much early on because they are a bit older. How will that affect their new experience of it? Will it be a positive reminiscing? Will it be something in the opposite, that they see as something that's not necessarily modern. But I think kind of going beyond that generational cleavage, I think we want to be cultivating those positive senses of social identity and understanding of the environmental impact so that people across generations and across the different spectrum of, I think in particular in France, where their revenue spectrum and apprehensions around purchasing power can be mitigated. I hope that makes sense.
And you share actually a great example about the new Quebec modernized GRS, including reuse. And you have for this generation actually a national application on your phone. And actually, when you return the container, you have the full synthesis of every return you did. And it's translated in GHG. And it's saying that you did good, extra. And they make a lot of awareness through actually the cell phone. And that's really interesting for young consumers. Hey, yeah, I got the app and I have all the information. That's like for the train example you shared that at the end, you have the real return of your effort in the global year. So that's very interesting. Thank you so much, Claire. I will maybe ask to the public, yes, one question. I feel you're waiting for it.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Claire. It was brilliant. Malika from RAP, question for you. Are there any clear determinants for consumers returning or refilling their packaging, in your opinion?
Can you say that again?
So what are the clear determinants for consumers returning or really refilling their packaging or engaging consumers to engage with the return refill system?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I like that you're kind of separating out the return behavior, because you're right to say that it's not necessarily because people kind of cultivate an intention to reuse that they will return. And so I think you're right in kind of singling that out as like a specific behavior. The easy kind of option is that return seems, just in terms of the data we've seen today and speaking to different experts on this topic, seems to be driven first and foremost by the deposit amount. So whether it's kind of worth their while, which will mean different things across countries, will mean different things across groups as well. In France, there seems to be a sweet spot around 15 to 25 cents, where people think now that it doesn't exist, which is a different thing to when it will exist in terms of how they see that. But in theory, seems to be kind of the sweet spot where people think, oh yes, I would do it, I would return it for that amount of money. As I said, I think you want to take into account whether that will discourage purchasing, in particular where there's a competition of other non-DRS or non-reusable options. But beyond that, I think for return, and we were talking about that, I think it's about the ease of it. So what we're seeing is that where it seems to be working well is where the return is anchored on the consumer journey. It's going to the store I usually go to. That's, again, in France, seen as the highest important factor that people say, I wouldn't return it if it was out of my way. 75% of people, and that goes up if you go for older age groups, say they wouldn't go further away than their usual stores and so on to go. And supermarkets seem to be kind of the key place that people want to go to. And then I would say just kind of oiling the wheels of that and making sure that the return is as easy as possible. So, short waiting times, different ways of getting the deposit back if possible that mean that they align with my preferences, whether it's immediate cash or being credited and so on. And I think, for the intention bit, we want to be acting on environmental understanding, pro-social understanding and so on. But for the return, the actual behavior of returning, I think it's all about making it as easy as possible.
One last question, sorry. But no problem, actually Claire will be there at the panel. So you have a second chance later.
Hi, do you include economic situations like inflation or also COVID into your data? And did you see massive changes in the consumer behavior and also their impulses to do it or not, and the relevance of reuse during COVID, before and after?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be clear, we haven't done any primary data collection on this topic. Very keen to, if anyone wants to be doing some experimentation, we're very keen to be doing some more testing on this. But in terms of the data we've looked at, obviously you would take into account the economic situation. And so we do see fluctuations across like those different contexts. My biggest word of caution, and I think everyone around the room will be aware of that, is kind of at this moment now that we are in terms of at least the French economic context, how do we make reuse the more palatable option and more attractive option when people are so deeply and rightly so concerned with purchasing power? And I think at least when there's a competition of other options available, it's going to be tricky to kind of have that acceptability around paying more at the point of purchase, in particular if we don't really nail the communication and the making it salient as to like how they get it back. But the short answer is yes, obviously when we look at the data, we take it in context. And word of caution for now is a tricky time.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you.